So I'm very pleased now to welcome onto the stage David Allvin, Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, who's going to give a keynote, and he will also be able to answer questions with the Chief of the Air Staff a little bit later. But please do give him a very warm round of applause. Thank you.
All right, well, good morning. I think I've got one of these fancy things. Well, it's great to be back, and always an honor to stand here and speak to this audience. This is the second year I've been able to do so, and thank you to Sir Rich for inviting me back, and add to my congratulations on your next posting. It's good for the UK, it's good for defense all around. So it's been a year hence since I stood here in front of this audience, and still didn't learn my lesson. And what I mean by that is that as I was preparing this, 'cause this is one of those you look forward to. This is a big deal when you get to stand in front of your peers who you greatly admire and respect, and then all of the academic brilliance and the industrial excellence that's in this room. You want to do something that's going to be big, right? So you put a few thoughts together and you think, I'm going to show them how erudite I am. Although I had to look that up this morning to make sure I was using it right. In the way that I'm going to make some profound statements that are going to amaze and delight them with my brilliance, and then you go through this the conference and you see that in the panels all your brilliance is being discussed in a greater sophistication than you ever imagined, and mostly with cooler accents. So now you're stuck, and so then you go to plan B and you think, well, now this is just going to look like it's cartoonish, so now what do I do? And so I thought, well, maybe, I know what, I'm going ahead of Rich. I'm going to go sneak and I'm going to steal his briefing, and I'm going to take it. But I guess the only thing that's more tightly kept in, Greg Bagwell's very extensive shoe collection is the content of Kaz Knighton's briefing. So I didn't have anything there to do. So what I'd like to do today is maybe give me a little grace. It won't be repetition, is maybe reinforcement, and share a couple thoughts if I might. So. Last year when I was here, I talked about collective agility, this idea that just because you have agile, a single Air Force, a single entity can be agile in its coordination, balance, the flexibility, all that goes with agility in a single entity doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to translate across to collective agility. It doesn't actually translate across the board. And sometimes it... So something else I learned, though, is if you make a movie and then you're told to make a sequel to the movie, then what you do is you find the thing that people laughed at in the first movie, and then you just make sure you put that into your second movie. So that way, if the rest of it's crap, they'll go, yeah, I remember the part about the birds? That was pretty funny. But this idea of individuals or individual air forces having certain attributes, but it only works if we understand how to do that together. It goes beyond just agility. And so when we look at the changing character of war, which has been talked about a lot the last couple of days, I could have about 3 or 4 slides about what it really privileges, and they are very synonymous with the attributes of air power. And I think that agility was one of those I talked about last year. I want to talk a little bit about speed and tempo, and we've had some conversations about that, about what that means on the modern day battle space, and what that means for air power going forward. And so as we look at the changing character of war, let's maybe go back a bit. The game of risk, right? World domination. But I think there's as an analog, there's some things that we can learn from that. Remember when you set up the risk board, you would put your pieces all in the right places. You'd figure out where the hell Kamchatka was and why that was important up there and how they could attack Alaska. But anyway, you'd have your forces all set up ahead of time. You put them where you wanted to, and then you'd roll the dice and the game would start. And in a little bit, that's sort of how we set piece when we start putting together our operational plans. We're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to go from this phase to that phase to the next phase. And in our Air Forces, specifically in the United States Air Force, we've been blessed in that the wars that we've been called upon to fight have largely been forward, have largely been away from our own sovereign soil. So to do that, we found the best way for air power was what? We would mass our forces just outside the contested environment, wherever that was. And we would, from there, that's where we could generate the speed and tempo to do what air forces do, right? To go and penetrate and degrade air defenses so you can gain and maintain air superiority, so you can prep the battle space for an unfair fight in our favor for the joint force. And the combined force. That's what you do. And so that's how we would set our pieces. But we need to recognize that, not everybody plays by the rules, and some people try and roll the dice before the game's supposed to start. We don't always get control over when that happens. And also when it comes to setting our pieces on the board, now there's adversaries who put up dense and very effective threat rings. Now, these are illustrative in nature. I mean, in some cases, there's maybe one that's quite a bit bigger than what might be represented here, and there might be another one that's quite a bit smaller than that's represented. But anyway, these threat rings, these dense threat environments, are how we would so oriented putting our pieces around the board conceptually. And that's where we would position our air forces, coming from the outside in. But there's a couple things there. We have many air forces that are within that already. And so we need to respect that and understand that this is the case, that we will be fighting with allies and partners who don't have the luxury of being outside and massing the force, penetrating, coming back out into a less contested environment, a more permissive environment, and generating that tempo. Because we can't put our pieces on the board exactly where we'd like to. And then as that grows, that becomes more and more of a factor. And for the United States Air Force, if we continue to be an Air Force that just is going to go from the outside in, that keeps moving. We're going to be fighting off the coast of California. And that doesn't do anybody any good, because speed and tempo. You cannot generate the tempo to have the effects that you want from that range if that's all you're doing. So we need to have a way in our United States Air Force, and we're looking at that in our force design, to leverage the fact that there are many of our air forces that are within those. That's, to me, in a way, that's a feature, not a glitch, because that's an opportunity for us to work better together to generate that speed and tempo early. Because as we've seen, some of our adversaries, they don't want to wait for all the forces to get there, because they know that they can't match our collective power. So they want to do what they can in their own speed and tempo. Change the facts on the ground early, the old fait accompli. Do that early, and before the forces can mass, then make them reassess. That's what we're going against. And so as we look at this, there are less and less permissive spaces from which we can set the pieces on the board and get ready to roll the dice. And then when we talk about our space and cyber, almost the entire globe is contested. It's just at what level of contestation is it? And that's what we need to be considering in how we build our air forces, combine our air forces to really generate the speed and tempo when it comes to engaging in major conflict. But this is, again, this is risk. This is world domination. But not everything is about peace or war. There are things in between, or full-on contact war. There are things in between. And in this dynamically changing international security environment, what our leaders need is options. They need options that don't pin us down into one thing or another. And that's where I think we have an air power moment right now. We are in an air power moment if we know how to leverage that, communicate that, and advance that. Because as case has been made here, and I'm sure will be throughout the rest of the day as well, is when we talk about the lessons learned. When the Ukraine conflict kicked off, there were a lot of back and forth. Well, air power doesn't matter anymore because you can't get air superiority. And this is what happens. Well, no, this is what happens if you can't get air superiority. But we didn't have a backstop against which to compare it. Oh, sure, we know the facts on the ground. This is what's happening in Ukraine. They are in a stalemate, and the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives with help from the allies and partners, but no clear air superiority. Well, we don't know what that looks like. Well, now we do. Another case, which is not the same, but it's good for comparison purposes when you look at it, what happened in the Middle East. When the Israeli forces gained some semblance of air superiority in 12 days, it enabled other objectives to be gained in a way 40 months on has not been able to be done either side in Ukraine. So now we have some more grist for the intellectual mill to be able to talk about what it means, air power means for nations, for militaries who are contemplating conflict. But it's not all just about domination. Again, air power, I think one of the attributes we should be talking about is that air power has the ability to go across the spectrum, which is where our dynamic international environment demands cases where the military instrument of power, which we don't want to throw out as the first thing, but it sure needs to be available and be credible, as a tool in the toolkit for our national leaders to be able to use. We need to understand that we have to have something that's good across the spectrum, and air power is uniquely capable of that because of the responsiveness, because of the reach. And so anything from, reestablishing deterrence. Now for chaps, first of all, I want to say this is nothing against our Australian partners because there's a kangaroo involved there. This is also nothing about advancing animal fighting. But imagine, if you will, there's a bully. In this case, the bully is the kangaroo, and it's bullying another entity. In this case, that entity being bullied or coerced is the dog. And then I would say the gentleman there is maybe air power. And if you look at this, now right now that kangaroo is reassessing his decision. He is trying to figure out, was that the right call or not? Reestablishing deterrence. Didn't have to flow tens of thousands of forces in to the theater and get ready for a bloody, long, enduring campaign. Rethink your position, son. May not be the right thing. That's at the one end. And then all the way, the layers, all the way up to, if it takes it, we can take it all. See, Rich, I got music. I mean, I don't have a walk-on thing, but I got music to mine. But again, air power as part of a joint force, or sometimes independently, it can take it all the way from just this re-establishing deterrence, all the way to, as part of a joint force, to decisive victory. We have those gradations along the scale within air power that we need to be able to leverage. But that's within an individual air force. We have many air forces here. And to be able to expand that from just the individual capability through speed and tempo, through the agility, to provide that range of options that I think our national leaders will need or require or will ask of us, I think there's more we can do collectively. So how do we scale this speed and tempo? This is where my brilliance was going to be. And as I put them up on the chart, I'm like, they already talked about them. So just as a reinforcement of that, when we talk about the equipment that we have, the capabilities, starting from co-use, we've been doing that for a while. Co-use has the advantage of we understand what that equipment does. We understand what those platforms do, what those capabilities do. So we're using the same platforms, and whether that be through, foreign military sales from one country to another, that's great. Being able to at least understand what those capabilities are, that provides more mass. And then there's co-production. We're also making some strides on that. Being able to, the co-production really helps you with the reconstitution, helps you with the increasing the amount that you can put back into the fight. Now, not for all of them. Obviously, some of the very highly sophisticated long lead platforms, it's not the case. But the more you have co-production across the allies and partners, you have the ability to reconstitute faster and regenerate. And then eventually it's the co-development. That co-development is just that next evolution. That co-development understands that we can leverage the brilliance and the ideas in the development of the designs that can be operated naturally together as though they were one. That's just sort of an evolution journey that we're on. And again, that's been talked about, this idea of going just from co-use all the way to co-development. Now, there are opportunities there. There are opportunities going forward for co-production and co-development. I think these are things, we have a moment now in which there are nations who have committed to increasing their spending on defense, and nations, as we've discussed here, the responsibility to commit those funds responsibly and effectively. And I think this is one area in which the sum will be much greater than the parts. Operations, this is an old saw. We've seen this before. The very start of deconfliction. Let's just not frat each other out. We've long passed that. We've been on this one for a while. And I would say we have not mastered, but the interoperability advances we've made, we might have hit the knee in the curve, but it's something that has to be tended, has to continue, because interoperability is not just about the platforms, it's about the TTPs, it's about the operations. And so I think we're doing fairly well on this, but the fact that we still have things as interoperability as a value proposition means we can't put it to bed as it's something that's so natural for us we can ignore. But then this is going to be my big ta-da. How about this idea of interchangeability? We've talked about that for 2 days. I think it's brilliant, though, that the folks in the panels and the exchanges that I've had, people are talking about interchangeability. That interchangeability, we really need to be able to articulate what that means. I mean, to me, there's all sorts of opportunities for interchangeability. Interchangeability of humans. We're already starting to do that. I should be able to have an airman in one Air Force, if it's the same platform and they understand that working on a system in another Air Force if it's the same platform. We should have not only the interchangeability of parts in some cases, this interchangeability, maybe interchangeability of putting different Air Forces in a single formation. This is just, it's the next level. And I think there's lots to be done in this area. And I think it's just that next level of understanding that while any Air Force could fight alone, it doesn't make sense to in many of the situations in which we find ourselves. So interchangeability is, again, that's one of those that's been spoken of with a lot more sophistication than I was ready to talk about here. So I took more notes, but I think that's hugely important. And finally, this idea of decision advantage. Decision advantage, not only in developing and in planning, but in the context of the conflict itself. That is a part and parcel about information sharing. Being able to share the links, be able to share the C2 architectures, to be able to have that decision advantage, that speed of recognition, speed of decision, speed of action, all those things happen in this decision superiority idea, this decision advantage. And it starts off with information sharing. And then probably more and more. Team, we got work to do on this. We all have work to do on this. And while I own and respect the fact that our nation has a certain amount of sovereignty and protectionism, and I found out so do we all. Every nation has that, as they should. But at some point, we have a greater sophistication available to us in how we can still do both. We can still protect the sovereignty of those things that we believe our nation should keep to ourselves, and still have better information sharing, still have better interconnectivity. I think we just need to design it that way. Because right now, we're still working with systems that, largely a big part of our United States Air Force was not built for this time, not designed for this time. So we have to figure out first how to add on to those capabilities that we have, this ability for better information sharing while protecting the sovereign interests of each of the nations involved. We can do this. But this is probably the hardest thing. This is probably the thing I've seen the least progress on, collectively, I think. And it's tough nut to crack. But once we do, once you unlock that, this idea of decision advantage, again, that's speed as well. That's speed and tempo of decision making. That's always having the adversary being reactive. We're not really going to realize that until we as allies and partners have the ability to share the relevant information at the right classification level to the warfighters at the right time. And I think that's the key we should really be shooting for here. And if we do that, then now imagine this risk board a little bit differently. Now instead of having the big parts here or there, you've got pieces of Air Forces all around that do not, when the balloon goes up, when somebody rolls the dice to start the game when everyone wasn't ready and thinking they're going to be able to generate the speed and tempo, we now have positioned in place all over the risk board Air Forces, parts of Air Forces, pieces of Air Forces that can come together and are not bound by the physics of terrestrial or maritime navigation and travel, that can rapidly come together, that can rapidly mass, that can rapidly develop that speed and tempo that can counter what the adversary might be trying to do, which is change the facts on the ground before we're fully ready to fight. That's what air power brings. And collectively, if we do that, we can move from this, which is fun, to this. Now we're all doing it. Or from this to this. This is the opportunity that we have to be collectively lethal. So once again, the sum of the parts being so much greater than each of them added together. And I think this is the value proposition of the speed and tempo that can be generated by Air Forces, not an Air Force. And so thanks very much for listening to me, and I look forward to your questions after we hear from Kaz Knighton. Thank you.